Listen to this sound. That is the roar of the P-51 Mustang's engine. And if you've ever heard it in person, you will never forget it. But what if I told you that this aircraft, this legendary, iconic machine, recognized as the greatest fighter of its era, wasn't supposed to exist at all? That the company that built it had never designed a fighter before? That they were given just 102 days to develop the prototype? Not years, not months. 102 days. Are you ready to find out how that was even possible? Because behind the Mustang lies a story you won't find in the textbooks. A story of people who slept on their drafting tables. Of a stroke of genius born in the middle of the night over a blank sheet of paper. Of a lucky coincidence that turned an ordinary contract into an absolute legend of aviation. The P-51 Mustang changed the sky. But few know what a miracle it was that it ever took flight. 102 days. Remember that number. It will haunt you throughout this video. Watch until the end, because at the finale, you will learn something that will make you look at this machine through completely different eyes. It is January 1940, Los Angeles. A closed-door meeting. This is where the story of the Mustang begins. Chapter 1, The Request. January 1940, Los Angeles. Outside the window, sunshine, palm trees, a peaceful Californian winter. But the men gathered in this room didn't come for the California sun. They came from Britain, and they had a problem. A serious problem. By this point, Europe had already been in a state of global conflict for over 4 months. The British Royal Air Force was in desperate need of new planes. Many planes. Fast. Right now. The British Purchasing Commission had visited every major American manufacturer. Lockheed, Curtiss, Bell. Everywhere they found backlogs, overloaded factories, and months of waiting. And then, someone whispered a name that initially caused nothing but confusion. North American Aviation. Who was North American in 1940? A company from Inglewood, California, founded in 1934. Their specialty? Trainers. Their main aircraft at the time was the T-6 Texan, a flight school workhorse. It was good, it was reliable, but it was a trainer, not a combat fighter. The British didn't come to them because they believed in them. They came because they had nowhere else to go. The company was headed by James Howard Kindelberger. Everyone called him Dutch. Large, energetic, with the voice of a man accustomed to giving orders and getting results. An ex-aviation engineer who had cut his teeth at Douglas and Boeing. A man who looked at a problem and saw an opportunity, not an obstacle. The British made him an offer that seemed simple. Take a license to build the Curtiss P-40. It was an existing fighter, already tested. Just put it into production in your factories, quickly and without questions. Dutch listened. He fell silent. And then he said something no one expected. We won't copy someone else's plane. We will build a better one. Silence hung in the room. The British glanced at each other. Some could barely suppress a smile. A company that makes trainers is going to build the world's best fighter? In what time frame? How long do you need? They asked. 120 days for the prototype, Dutch replied. The British agreed. Perhaps they didn't believe it was possible. Perhaps they simply had nothing to lose. But the contract was signed. That same evening, Dutch Kindelberger called his lead aerodynamicist. Edgar Schmued picked up the phone. He didn't yet know that this call would change his life. And not just his. Imagine a room. Long tables buried under blueprints. The smell of tobacco and machine oil. The glow of lamps that never went out, day or night. And people, dozens of them, hunched over drafting boards with pencils in hand. No computers, no digital modeling, no high-tech aerodynamic simulation programs. Only minds, hands, and the incredible pressure of a clock ticking away every hour. This is how the P-51 Mustang was born. Dutch Kindelberger assembled the team fast. He had no choice. The clock was already running. But the people he gathered weren't just engineers. They were fanatics. Men who thought about planes all day and saw them in their dreams at night. The lead aerodynamicist for the project was Edgar Schmued. Remember that name, because without him, there would be no Mustang. Schmued was 33 years old in 1940. Short, quiet, with a habit of speaking slowly and to the point. Colleagues remembered. He could sit in silence for hours, staring at a single spot. Then he would pick up a pencil and in minutes, sketch a solution others had spent weeks searching for. It was Schmued who proposed the secret sauce of the Mustang, the laminar flow wing. It sounds dry and technical, but behind that term lies a revolution. Most planes of that time had wings with maximum thickness at the front, where the air met the most resistance. Schmued proposed moving the thickest point of the wing back, closer to the middle. This allowed the air to slide over the surface longer in a smooth, laminar flow, without creating unnecessary drag. The result? Less drag, more speed, better maneuverability. Simple, brilliant. And before Schmued, no one had dared to put it on a mass-produced fighter. But here is the catch. He drew that blueprint in a single night. Colleagues remembered him coming in the next morning, eyes red from lack of sleep. He laid the sheet on the table and said quietly, "Here is our advantage." No one argued. Because when you look at a Schmued drawing, the genius is obvious. That's how it is with truly great solutions. Working alongside Schmued was Raymond Rice, the chief engineer. If Schmued was the brain of the project, Rice was its spine. He translated brilliant ideas into concrete blueprints, dimensions, and tolerances. He made sure that what was drawn on paper could actually be built by hands on the shop floor. And that shop floor worked at a pace that today would be called impossible. People arrived at 6 in the morning. They left, if they left, late at night. Some simply stayed, right there in the design bureau. They would spread their coats over the drafting tables and sleep for 3 or 4 hours. Then they would get up and keep going. No one forced them to work like that. No orders, no pressure from above. People simply understood. What they were doing was vital, and they didn't want to fail. That, not the blueprints, not the engines, not the calculations, is the true secret of the Mustang. The people. But these people had a rigid limit, and the clock kept ticking. 102 days. Let's stop for a second and realize what that means in practice. A modern fighter jet, from a blank sheet to the first flight, takes an average of 5 to 15 years to develop. That's thousands of engineers, billions of dollars, supercomputers, wind tunnels, and endless red tape. Kindelberger's team had 102 days, 2,448 hours, and zero margin for error. Day 1. Schmued is already working on the wing. Rice is delegating tasks. Dutch personally walks to every desk, not as a boss, but as someone just as invested as everyone else. Maybe more. Design and production ran in parallel. It sounds logical, but in practice, it's chaos. While one group is drawing the tail section, another is already bending metal for the fuselage. If a drawing changes, everything changes. Mid-process, on the fly. It wasn't an assembly line. It was a living organism building itself. By the end of the second week, the scale of the task became clear. The Mustang wasn't just a new plane. It was a fundamentally different machine. Schmued's laminar wing required incredible manufacturing precision. The tolerances, the allowed deviations from size, were several times tighter than on any other aircraft of the time. The slightest inaccuracy, and the whole point of the laminar profile would be lost. The workers on the floor didn't understand why such precision was needed at first. Then they did, and they began to work differently. On the 30th day, the prototype began to take shape. The fuselage, long, streamlined, almost predatory, was already on the jigs. Workers seeing it for the first time would stop and just stare. There was something special about this silhouette, even without wings, even without an engine. One mechanic recalled, "I looked at it and thought, this thing will fly. I didn't know how, I just knew." On the 50th day, engine installation began. The Allison V1710, a liquid-cooled inline engine, powerful and reliable at low altitudes. The whole plane was designed around it. Its installation revealed a new problem: the cooling system. Schmued proposed a non-standard solution. He placed the radiator, the core of the cooling system, not in the nose, as everyone else did, but under the fuselage, behind the pilot's cockpit. He designed a special duct with an expanding channel. The hot air, exiting the radiator, created additional jet thrust. The system cooled the engine, and simultaneously push the plane forward. This is called the Meredith effect, and it is another small piece of genius hidden inside the Mustang. Then came day 67, and this is where everything nearly collapsed. The delivery of key landing gear components was delayed. A supplier had failed. The parts didn't arrive on time. Without them, assembly couldn't be finished. Without assembly, there was no first flight. Without a flight on time, there was no contract. The team had exactly 72 hours to find a solution. Dutch Kindelberger didn't panic. He picked up the phone and started calling, personally. Suppliers, subcontractors, fellow factory directors. People remembered. He called in the middle of the night and spoke calmly, without threats. He simply explained what was happening and what needed to be done. On the third day, the parts were delivered. The clock kept ticking, but the Mustang kept being built. And when day 102 arrived, it was ready. October 26th, 1940. Muroc Airfield, California. Early morning. The air is cold and crisp. The sky over the desert is a piercing blue, without a single cloud. A perfect day for flying. On the airfield stands a plane. It has already been painted. Olive drab camouflage, British markings. On the side, the number AG345. But for everyone standing around it, it's not a number. It's 102 days of their lives. It's the sleepless nights, the cold coffee at 3 a.m., the arguments over blueprints, the crisis on day 67. It's their plane. The whole factory came out to the airfield. Engineers, mechanics, draftsmen, janitors. People who had seen this plane in pieces were now seeing it whole, for the first time, in the morning light of the California desert. Dutch Kindelberger stood slightly apart, hands in his pockets. His face was calm, but those who knew him noticed. He was clenching and unclenching his fists inside his pockets, over and over. Vance Breeze approached the aircraft. North American's test pilot, tall, laconic, with that specific confidence in his movements found only in men who have spent thousands of hours in the sky. He walked around the machine slowly, feeling the control surfaces, peering into the intake, running his hand over the perfectly smooth surface of the laminar wing. Then he stopped. He looked at Schmued. Schmued nodded. Breeze climbed into the cockpit. The mechanics sealed the canopy. The Allison engine coughed once, twice, and roared. The sound rolled across the airfield, and the crowd involuntarily stepped back. The plane began its roll. Those standing there that morning remembered the same thing. The takeoff roll was short. Someone in the crowd exhaled. Someone. Someone in the crowd exhaled. Someone grabbed their neighbor's sleeve. Someone simply froze, head tilted back. The Mustang climbed, smoothly, confidently, without the slightest sign of instability. Breeze banked into the first turn, then the second. The machine responded perfectly, responsive, light, like an extension of the pilot rather than a separate mechanism. 40 minutes later, the Mustang landed. Breeze climbed out of the cockpit. He took off his helmet. He looked at Kindelberger, and he smiled. What happened next was like the finale of a championship game. People hugged right on the runway. Some laughed. Some, it happens, just stood and stared in silence because there were no words. Schmued was found off to the side. He was sitting on a crate, looking up at the sky where his plane had just been, quietly talking to himself. No one dared to approach him. The flight data was handed to the British Commission that same day. Speed, maneuverability, handling, range. By every metric, the Mustang surpassed the Curtiss P-40 the British had originally wanted to copy. But in the data, there was one indicator. One column of numbers that few paid attention to at first. High-altitude performance. At low and medium altitudes, brilliant. But above 15,000 feet, the Allison engine began to falter. Power dropped. Speed dropped. Maneuverability dropped. And it was there, at high altitudes, that the most important air battles of the era were decided. The Mustang existed. It flew. It was beautiful. but it had an Achilles heel. And it was this flaw that almost killed the entire program. British pilots are a special breed. They had been through everything. The grueling dogfights over the English Channel, the sleepless alerts on the airfields, the losses no one talks about out loud. These men trusted their machines, Spitfires, Hurricanes, the way you trust a brother in arms. Every bolt, every ounce of pressure on the stick was familiar to the point of instinct. And then they are told, "Here is your new plane. It's American, from a company none of you have ever heard of." The reaction was predictable. One pilot from the RAF's 26th Squadron recalled, "We looked at it like a stranger brought into the family. Pretty, yes, but is he one of us?" The first Mustang Mark Is arrived in Britain in early 1942. The machines were unloaded at the docks, hauled to airfields, and pilots went to inspect them with that look a professional gives an outsider. The first thing everyone noticed was the cockpit. Compared to a Spitfire, spacious, almost luxurious. The visibility forward and to the sides, excellent. The instrument panel, logical, well thought out. The seat, comfortable. One pilot wrote in his diary, "The Americans clearly thought about the man inside." It was a small but vital detail. Men who spend 8 hours in a cockpit notice these things. The first flights confirmed what the creators already knew. At low and medium altitudes, the Mustang was magnificent. In a straight line, it was noticeably faster than the P-40 and comparable to the latest Spitfires. The handling was smooth and responsive, with no nasty surprises. But as soon as they climbed above 15,000 feet, the picture changed. The Allison engine didn't have a high-altitude supercharger. This meant that in the thin, cold air, the Mustang became a different machine. Slower, heavier, more vulnerable. The RAF command was quick to reach a conclusion. If it can't go high, we'll use it low. The Mustang was assigned tasks it was perfectly suited for. Tactical reconnaissance, ground attack strikes, low-altitude escort, coastal patrols. And here, right here, the Mustang began to show its teeth. Pilots returned from missions writing things in the reports that seemed like exaggerations at first. The range, phenomenal. The stability at low altitudes, better than anything they had flown before. The sea-level speed, so fast that almost nothing could escape it. Sergeant Charles Twitchett of 268 Squadron wrote a line in his report that was quoted many times after. "This is the best American plane I have ever had to fly." Modest praise, unless you knew he had flown everything the American industry produced. Slowly, something began to change. Pilots stopped comparing the Mustang to the Spitfire. They began to see it as its own machine, with its own character, its own strengths, its own logic in the air. Among combat pilots, that is the highest form of respect. By mid-1942, the waiting list for Mustangs began to grow. Pilots were requesting to be assigned to squadrons flying the P-51. Not because they were ordered to, but because rumors in aviation travel fast. And the rumors about the Mustang were good. But everyone, the pilots, the engineers, and Dutch Kindelberger himself, understood one thing. The potential of this plane hadn't even been half unlocked. Somewhere inside that airframe, another plane was sleeping. Faster, higher, deadlier. They just needed to find the right heart for it. And one day, on an ordinary afternoon at a British airfield, a man climbed into a Mustang, took off, and upon landing, said a few words that changed everything. April 1942. Duxford Airfield, England. Ronald Harker was there on business. A routine visit. He was a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, a man whose job was to fly different machines and give them a professional evaluation. He had flown dozens of planes. This was just another day, another plane. The plane was called the Mustang. Harker spent about half an hour in the air. Then he landed, climbed out, and stood by the machine for a few minutes. Silent, looking at it. Then he took out a notebook and started calculating. He was thinking about one thing. This airframe, this incredible, aerodynamically perfect airframe with Schmued's laminar wing, was being held back by a mediocre engine. An engine that couldn't unlock its potential. It was like putting a weak motor into a perfectly built race car. But Rolls-Royce had a different engine, the Merlin. If you have even a passing interest in aviation, you know that name. The Merlin powered the Spitfire, the Hurricane, the Lancaster. It was one of the greatest aero engines of its time, powerful, high altitude, with a superb two-stage supercharger that kept its muscle where the Allison started to choke. Harker went back to his office and wrote a memo. Short, clear, no fluff. The point was simple. If we put a Merlin in the Mustang, we will have the best fighter in existence. His conclusions were met with resistance at first. Bureaucracy works the same everywhere. Why change the engine on a plane that's already in production? It costs money. It takes time. It means redesigning the entire engine mount. It's a risk. Let's wait and see. But Harker persisted, and he found allies. At Rolls-Royce, he was backed by the chief engineer. In the RAF, officers realized that the Mustang's altitude problem wasn't a minor flaw. It was a strategic limitation. And if it could be fixed, it had to be fixed. Simultaneously, on the other side of the Atlantic, American engineers at Packard, who were building the Merlin under license, independently started asking, what if? Two worlds were thinking the same thing, and eventually, they took the leap. The conversion wasn't easy. The Merlin was bigger, heavier. It had different mounting geometry. They had to completely redesign the engine bay, the cooling system, and the intakes. The center of gravity changed, which meant the balance of the whole plane had to be recalculated. Engineers worked for months. This was a different kind of race, not against a deadline, but against their own doubts. No one knew for sure. Would it work? Or would the whole thing be an expensive mistake? The first Mustang with a Merlin engine took flight in the autumn of 1942. The pilot climbed. He made a pass over the airfield. Then he went higher, up where the Allison used to gasp for air. And he kept going. When he landed, the field was silent. Everyone was watching him. The pilot took off his helmet. He paused for a second. Then he said just one thing. It's a different aircraft. He was right. It really was a different plane. Where the power used to drop and the machine became vulnerable, the Mustang now only accelerated. The Merlin with its two-stage supercharger let the engine breathe fully at any altitude. The speed increased so much that the new numbers seemed like measurement errors. They were double-checked several times. Imagine a man who had been running his whole life with a heavy pack on his shoulders. He ran well, with good technique. And then the pack was removed. That's what it looked like. An American airframe. A British engine. It sounded like a compromise. It turned out to be the recipe for perfection. The new version was designated the P-51B, and when its performance specs landed on the desks of the commanders, one thing was clear. The Allies had a fighter that had no equal in the sky. But for that to become clear to everyone, the Mustang needed one specific mission. A mission no one else could solve. Picture this. Early morning over England. One by one, heavy four-engine B-17 Flying Fortress bombers lift off from their bases. Dozens of machines. Hundreds. They form up and head east. Over the Channel, over occupied Europe, deep into the heart of the continent. They are covered by fighters, Spitfires, Thunderbolts. Excellent machines. The best available. But somewhere over Germany, roughly halfway to the target, the escort fighters begin to turn back. Not because they want to, but because their fuel is running low. To fly further means never making it home. And the bombers are left alone. It was in that moment, that specific moment when the escorts turned away, that they were waiting. Interceptors appeared as if out of thin air. They attacked the formation, and the massive, heavy, lumbering B-17s could neither run nor properly defend themselves. The losses were catastrophic. In the autumn of 1943, the Allies conducted a series of raids on factories in Schweinfurt, a vital industrial center deep in Germany. The second raid went down in history as one of the darkest days for American bomber aviation. Of the 291 planes that took off, 60 did not return. Another 17 were so badly damaged they never flew again. 60 planes in one day. 600 crewmen. The command looked at these numbers and realized, this cannot continue. Deep raids without fighter cover weren't a strategy. They were a death sentence. They needed a solution. And there was no solution. The P-47 Thunderbolt, powerful and rugged, could only reach the western border of Germany, with drop tanks a bit further, but not to Berlin, not to Dresden, not where the bombs needed to fall. The P-38 Lightning had the range, but at high altitudes in the freezing European sky, its engines were temperamental. Pilots froze in unheated cockpits. Reliability was a nightmare. The problem seemed unsolvable. Physics versus strategy. Until the P-51 Mustang with the Merlin engine appeared in the European sky. Drop tanks, external fuel tanks that could be jettisoned when empty, gave the Mustang a range that seemed fantasy for a single-engine fighter. To Berlin and back, to Poland, to Czechoslovakia, places no escort fighter had ever dreamed of reaching. And all the while, up at those high altitudes where the Allison choked, the Merlin purred with power. The first Mustangs appeared over Berlin in early March 1944. For German pilots, it was a profound shock. They were used to the idea that by the time bombers reached the capital of the Reich, they would be alone. And suddenly, American fighters, here, over Berlin. Legend has it that when Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring saw the report of Mustangs over Berlin, he said something that many would repeat. The sentiment was simple. If American fighters have reached here, then we have lost the war. It wasn't a defeat in a single battle. It was a strategic admission. The Mustang didn't just escort bombers. It changed the logic of the entire air campaign. Now, the bombers could fly anywhere, and know that there was a shield above them. To the target and back. Bomber losses began to drop. Not overnight, but steadily. And the Mustang's reputation continued to grow. Pilots returning from these long missions said the same thing. 8 hours in the air, Berlin and back. And the machine, vibrant, responsive, reliable, was there the whole time, like a faithful partner. But the men behind the controls were very different people. And some of their stories, too often forgotten, must be told. Behind every great plane are the people. Not statistics, not sorties or kill counts. People, with names, stories, habits, superstitions, and photos tucked into their flight suit pockets. The Mustang drew extraordinary people to it, and their stories deserve to be told. Clarence Bud Anderson, one of the highest-scoring Mustang pilots in the U.S. Air Force. Tall, red-haired, with a quiet voice and a habit of smiling like he knew something you didn't. His plane was called Old Crow, named after his mother's favorite whiskey. His fuselage was covered in victory marks. Anderson spoke of the Mustang like this. When you're in the air and you feel that machine, you don't think of it as mechanical. You think of it as alive. It answers you. It listens. That isn't poetry. That's the professional observation of a man who spent hundreds of hours in a P-51 cockpit. Every pilot had his rituals. One would touch a specific rivet on the fuselage before takeoff. Another would never wear new gloves, only old, worn-in ones he had survived with before. Some talked to the plane out loud and didn't think it was strange at all. Because in the air, at 25,000 feet, in the cold and isolation of a long-range raid, the plane really did become a living being, a partner, the only thing keeping you alive. But among all the stories of Mustang pilots, there is one that cannot be skipped, a story that is bigger than aviation. The 332nd Fighter Group. These pilots entered history under two names. The official one, the 332nd Fighter Group of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The unofficial one, the one everyone knows, the Tuskegee Airmen. Let me tell you something important. In the United States military at that time, official segregation existed. This meant that African American servicemen served in separate units. Many high-ranking officers openly doubted that black pilots were capable of flying modern combat aircraft. These doubts had no basis in reality, but they existed, and they pressed down hard. The Tuskegee Airmen proved them wrong, not with words, but with deeds. They trained in Tuskegee, Alabama, a separate flight school created specifically for them. The program was brutal. Some said intentionally so, to find a reason to fail them. The pilots who made it through were ready for anything. They arrived in Europe in 1944, and they transitioned to the P-51 Mustang. They painted their planes in a unique way. The tail section, bright red. It wasn't just decoration, it was a signature. Anyone who saw a red tail in the sky knew who they were. And here is where the story becomes legendary. The bomber crews that the 332nd escorted began to specifically request them. Not just any fighters, specifically the red tails. Because rumors in aviation travel fast, and the rumors about the Tuskegee Airmen were very specific. In all their time flying escort missions for the 15th Air Force, not a single bomber under their protection was lost to enemy fighters. Stop for a second and realize that number. Not one. That wasn't luck. It wasn't a fluke. It was the result of training, professionalism, and men who had something to prove, and who proved it 10 times over. Their commander, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, a West Point graduate, the son of a general, a man with a posture and a gaze you never forgot. He demanded one thing from his pilots: to fly better than everyone else. Not because they had to, but because every flight was an answer to everyone who said it was impossible. They answered every single time. In the air, the P-51 Mustang gave these men a machine worthy of their talent, and they gave the Mustang a page in history that can never be erased. But the story of the plane itself didn't end there, because the Mustang turned out to be one of those rare machines that simply doesn't know how to grow old. The war in Europe is over. Thousands of planes around the world suddenly became unnecessary. The industry that had been running at peak capacity stopped. Airfields emptied. Machines that were on the front lines yesterday were now sitting in rows under the open sky, waiting for their fate. For most of them, that fate wasn't kind. Fighters and bombers went to the scrap heap by the thousands. It was a cruel but logical reality. The metal was needed for reconstruction. Maintaining a massive war fleet in peacetime was too expensive. Legendary machines were turned into aluminum ingots for pots, pans, and window frames. The Mustang could have shared that fate, but it didn't. First, Korea. In 1950, when a new conflict flared up on the Korean peninsula, it turned out that jet aviation wasn't yet ready to do everything. Specifically, ground support, low-level strikes, and patrols. The Mustang was called back into service. Veterans who had flown the P-51 in Europe climbed back into familiar cockpits. They said, "Nothing has changed. The same responsiveness, the same character, the same reliability." The Korean War was the last combat chapter for the Mustang in the U.S. Air Force. But it wasn't the last chapter overall, because then something unexpected happened. When the military began selling off Mustangs in large numbers, private citizens started buying them. Farmers, businessmen, former pilots who couldn't part with their favorite machine. The price for a surplus P-51 in the early 1950s was laughable by today's standards, just a few $1,000s. And a completely different life began: racing. The National Championship Air Races in Reno, Nevada. If you've never seen this, imagine. Piston-engine planes screaming along at 50 feet off the deck, banking around pylons at over 400 miles per hour. The stands roar. The ground trembles from the engine noise. And in the front ranks, the Mustang. Always the Mustang. Racers pushed the Merlin engines to limits the Rolls-Royce engineers never dreamed of. They squeezed out horsepower that shouldn't have been physically possible. The machines became faster, meaner, more dangerous, and they kept flying. One of the most famous racing Mustangs, Strega, held speed records for piston aircraft at Reno for years. It wasn't a war machine anymore. It was a purebred racing monster with the heart of a P-51. Meanwhile, collectors began to gather them. People who understood. These planes are living history. They cannot be allowed to vanish. They began hunting for machines all over the world, in the backlots of old airfields, in the jungles of Pacific Islands, in Latin American military museums. They restored them bolt by bolt, using archival photos and the memories of old mechanics. And here is what is staggering. Today, there are more than 150 flying P-51 Mustangs in the world. Not museum pieces behind glass. Flying. For real. Think about that number. The plane is over 80 years old. The era it was created in is ancient history. But it flies. The value of a well-restored P-51 today is between $2 and $5 million. Some have gone for more. It's not just a plane, it's a piece of art that knows how to fly. At airshows around the world, in Oshkosh, Duxford, or Reno, when a Mustang passes over the field, the same thing happens. People lift their heads. They stop. They go silent. Because that sound, that specific Merlin roar, cannot be confused with anything else. It goes right through you. Not through your ears, but through your chest. Through something deeper. 80-year-old veterans weep at these shows. Not from sadness. From something else for which there aren't always words. And next to them stand children, 7, 8, 10 years old, looking at the sky with their mouths open. They don't know the history of this machine. They just feel it. This is something real. And you know what? They're right. Because the P-51 Mustang is more than just a plane. It is proof of what human beings are capable of when they work at the absolute limit of their potential. When they believe in what they are doing. When they refuse to accept impossible as an answer. But we have to go back to the finish. Back to where we started. To those 102 days. Let's go back to the beginning. January 1940. A blank sheet of paper on a drafting table. A man with a pencil. And a number. 102 days, hanging over it all like a sentence or a challenge. It depends on how you look at it. Dutch Kindelberger could have walked away. He could have said, "We make trainers. This isn't our lane. Go to the experts." No one would have blamed him. It would have been the logical thing to do. He didn't walk away. Edgar Schmued could have drawn a conventional wing. Proven. Reliable. Something that already worked. Why risk it with a laminar profile? New, untested, requiring impossible manufacturing precision. He drew the laminar one. Ronald Harker could have just written his flight report, filed it away, and gone home. His job was to fly and evaluate. Not to push ideas, not to convince skeptics, not to lobby engineers. He took out his notebook and started calculating. The Tuskegee Airmen could have broken under the pressure of a system that was against them from the start. They could have accepted the world's low opinion of them as truth. They could have decided that proving anything to an unfair world was pointless. They flew, and they didn't lose a single bomber. That is the true story of the P-51 Mustang. It's not in the technical specs, though they are brilliant. It's not in the speed or range records, though they are impressive. It's not in the kill counts, though they were enough to write the machine into history forever. The true story is in the people who, at every point on this journey, chose the hard path. Because the hard path led exactly where they needed to go. 102 days. From the start, that number sounded like an impossibility. It is an industrial record that has not been broken to this day. A combat fighter prototype, from a blank sheet to the first flight, in 102 days. But you know what the most amazing part is? When you read the memoirs of the people who worked those 102 days, none of them talk about the record. None of them say, "We were making history. We knew it was impossible. We were overcoming ourselves." They say something else. They say, "We were just working. We believed in what we were doing. We didn't think of the deadline as a sentence. We thought of it as a goal." Every day was a step forward. Every problem was just a task with a solution. That's the whole secret. No magic, no special formula, just people who believed and did. Today, Somewhere at an airshow in Oshkosh or Duxford or Reno, a P-51 Mustang passes over the field. It is more than 80 years old. The Merlin engine sounds exactly as it did in 1944. Schmued's laminar wing cuts the air just as precisely as it did on the day of its first flight, and the people on the ground lift their heads. They stop. They listen. Because that sound, that specific, unmistakable roar, is not just mechanics. It is the voice of people who once decided that 102 days was enough. That impossible is just something that hasn't been done yet. That if it's vital, a way will be found. Kindelberger, Schmued, Rice, Harker, Anderson, Davis, the Tuskegee Airmen, the mechanics who slept on their drafting tables, the workers who bent metal with a precision no one expected of them. They are all here, in every pulse of that engine. 102 days. They changed the sky. They changed history. And that sound? It's still in the air. Thank you for watching. Subscribe, hit the like button, and let me know your thoughts in the comments.